Hello and welcome to our episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today we've got a bit of a different episode for you, and it's one I'm very, very excited about. A couple of weeks ago we got introduced to Jo Bauer. She is absolutely fantastic and talks about one of my favourite things in the world, which is the whole concept of coaching and self-development. Jo, it is wonderful to have you in the studio today.
Thanks, Toby. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for coming in. As I said, look, executive coaching is something there which I've got a big passion for. When we met a couple of weeks ago, it was something which we could have been speaking about for hours. So we'll try and keep it all into about half an hour today. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes. So I'm an executive coach and I'm also a lawyer. And I practiced law for 24 years and latterly as an equity partner in a large city global firm. And actually, it was through my partnership role and leadership that I actually had coaching myself. And I really benefited from one-to-one coaching. And I developed a coaching style of leadership. And it was really through that I saw my teams really benefit and really perform well and become dedicated teams. And so I went into coaching because I want to share that experience and knowledge with other people. And so now I coach leaders and executives to be their best and for their teams to perform at their best. It's
a really interesting sort of pathway, that, isn't it? Because going from the law for 24 years to moving into something there and doing such a change, in that sort of thing. Because I don't think people generally look at that industry and think of it as a sort of bastion of coaching and development and such like. I know it's very academic and there's a lot of detail that goes into it, but you don't often think about, even in the big practices, about the impact of leadership within it. How did that sort of come across as something which you wanted to be invested in first and foremost?
Yeah, that's a great question, because actually my mantra is really to put people at the heart of leadership. And I think that to create a successful law firm or business, you really need to have a coaching culture. And so putting people at the heart of leadership can really help that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that whole people thing is obviously a big part of my whole world and has been for the past 20, 25 years or so. And I think that sort of development piece is so important, and which comes into the whole concept of executive coaching. So as you mentioned, it was a mentorship piece that came to you. It sort of sparked the interest, which became a passion, a dedication, a job for you alongside that as well. Tell me a little bit about what executive coaching means, because I think lots of people see it in different ways, and some people will have their opinions of it. Some people will be looking at it and saying, well, that's not for me, but not really understand the whole benefits of it and such like, and how it can work. What is executive coaching?
Good question. So I know from watching some of your interviews, particularly your interview with Simon Hartley, the sports psychologist, that you've got an interest in sports psychology and how that transfers into business. And in the same way, the psychology of sports coaching has transferred into the psychology of coaching into the executive business world. And that's how coaching began. And I think it's really important to sort of have that in the background. So there was this chap called Sir John Whitmore, and he pioneered executive coaching. His explanation of coaching was that coaching unlocks your potential to maximise your own performance. And Whitmore was a really interesting guy. He was a racing car driver, and he was in the Ford team that won Le Mans in the 60s. And he hooked up with a guy called Timothy Galway. Now, Tim Galway was captain of the tennis team at Harvard at around the same time. And Tim Galway wrote The Inner Game of Tennis, I think in 76. And then after that, soon he wrote The Inner Game of Golf, The Inner Game of Skiing and Music. And what that inner game theory is that it's all about your inner critic. And what Galway said was that the opponent in your head is more formidable than the opponent on the other side of the net. That's really interesting, because that's all about your inner critic, and that can be translated also into business. So a coach can help with the inner critic. What he discovered is that if you can coach someone to get rid of those inner obstacles, then a natural ability to learn and perform will happen naturally without much technical input from the coach. And so in business, that's also helpful, because if your coach can help you get rid of those inner obstacles and really silence that inner critic, amazing things happen.
It's fascinating, that, isn't it? Because I think tennis is one of those games itself where I see momentum shifts happen more than anywhere else, and that can only be a mental thing, right? So you see someone who's 2 sets down and can't hit the ball, and then all of a sudden the momentum completely swings in the game and they win the match 3-2. And I don't know if you've read Andre Agassi's book Open, and the whole incredible read. But the whole thing there about the significance and the importance of the mind in that whole process is absolutely remarkable. And I think when you look at business as a whole, there's a lot of technical coaching that goes in. Naturally, in your old profession, there's a lot of natural coaching that goes into all of that. If you look at technology, there's a whole lot of physical learning that has to happen to be able to make things work in the way they do. In sales, there's a whole piece there about the technical process of the sales job. And I think people will lurch a lot to the technical aspect of the job. But I think it's almost exclusively, if I look at high performers and consistent high performance, that ability to maintain a strong mindset, to create momentum off the back of that, is one of the things that's most underlooked and probably the biggest driver to success or failure in a business and an individual within a business, full stop. Yet we will put sales trainers into people, we will put technology trainers into people, but we won't necessarily have people who work exclusively or focus or have bespoke training about mindset and how that delivers. Why do you think that is?
I think that's probably because it's a sort of culture thing, but I think it's interesting you were saying you put training into people, but that's not enough. And actually there was a study that was done, and when people were trained into sort of leadership development and they had just the training, they improved by about 22%. But if you coupled that with one-to-one coaching, the improvement went up to 88%.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible, and actually coaching does work, because I think what we said, you were asking initially, and I went off on some sports tangent, was actually...
I can bring it back to sports tangents very easily.
It's what is coaching, and actually coaching with a one-to-one coach is actually sitting down with somebody and saying, what are your objectives, what are your goals? And the coach can really help focus on that by asking really powerful, curious questions that helps the person dig very deep and really open up and find that self-awareness. And then they will find the answers to their own problems. Because what you do is you work out, well, what are my options? What are the opportunities for me out there? What are the obstacles that might be getting in the way? What resources do I need to reach that goal? And what the coach can help you do is to get there and open the door for you. The coach can't walk through the door for you, because responsibility for your action rests with the coachee. Yeah,
I think there's a really important part you just mentioned there about the quality and the importance of great questioning. And I think there's a real desire when you're coaching someone, from a mindset perspective, just to give them the answer. And I think actually if you look at a lot of management full stop, a lot of leadership full stop, there's a real temptation, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of people to cover, etc., etc. So someone comes in with a problem, you give them the answer and they move on from it. But the development there doesn't come into it, so they come looking back for that helicopter parenting piece that comes back into it. But the best leaders that I've ever worked with and the best coaches I've ever been involved with, their super skill is asking great questions. And I think that's a really important part of it, so people come to their own conclusions and bring that out as well. When I mentioned beforehand, I think there's sometimes a little bit of resistance about people when they hear coaching, and particularly when they look at it. And I've had people who I've known and worked with for a long time, and when they hear about someone coming in from outside their industry, there's an immediate sort of reticence about whether they're going to engage with it, and they're saying, particularly when you bring a sports analogy into play. For me, it works really clearly. For them, it'll be like, but that's ice hockey. How's it got anything to do with what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis? And I think it's an important aspect for those people to be able to sort of probably be positioned in a slightly different way and to see things in a slightly different way alongside that. And I think the best coaches are able to adapt to those individuals. But when you look at who needs coaching and how you get them to buy into that sort of thing, how does that come about for you?
Well, look, people get to be successful because of technical brilliance, but what got you here won't get you there. And actually there's a chap called Marshall Goldsmith who wrote a book entitled What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And that's because he said quite succinctly that when great leaders get to be there but they don't necessarily have those people skills. And actually, the higher you climb up that corporate ladder, the more the issues become behavioural. And you're not taught how to manage people. So if I was to say to you, look, you have to appoint your next CFO, and you had two candidates, one who was a technically brilliant accountant, but slightly socially inept, perhaps alienated the people under him, or you had another candidate who was okay at accountancy, but had brilliant social skills, a great manager, who would you appoint?
I know which one I go for out of that. But it's not the same for everyone, though, with that, isn't it? Because I think there's this common battle which I see with people in hiring is about technical skills over development. And so, and that's particularly prevalent in the in the IT sector. So if we've got people there, they've got an immediate need. They need someone who's got X and Y and Z skills with X amount of years of experience, and they have someone there who might be absolutely perfect on paper, but not necessarily, as you say, as good and strong a people person as possible. On the other side, you've got someone there you've got to invest more time into, which you might be under pressure not to be able to do, but has way greater potential and much greater team fit. Now, our job is consistently to try and get people to have people in there that last the course and stay in for a long time. And I think if you look at attrition in the industry, full stop, there's not a great level of retention in the tech sector. I think there's something recently where we looked about big tech where it's something like 14 months of average tenure for people in big tech businesses. That's appalling, and it's expensive, and it's not, I don't think, particularly good for the incumbents in that space as well, because I think they are trying to find square pegs for square holes, for squares, shall I say, and keep them into those particular pigeonholes. And I think actually you're exactly right there. Is if you can look at that and say, right, this is the person with the emotional intelligence and the leadership skills and the personality, that should be the natural sort of play. But I'm not 100% sure it always is.
No, and you're absolutely right, and that's the problem, isn't it? Because you can get people who are so brilliant, they've got to where they are. And actually, those are the things that you put on your CV. But the higher you climb up the corporate ladder, that's actually becomes less significant. So when you think of a great leader, you think, well, what is it that makes them great? It's got to be something else. And that something else is actually something that you can develop through coaching.
And so when you go back to those two people and you see the sort of top performer there who might not necessarily be the best leader or manager, is everyone coachable?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, the answer is not everybody is coachable because it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of time. But people who understand that there might be something that they can improve on, those people are coachable. I mean, you're always going to get those outliers who are just stubborn with their heads buried in the mud. But I think most people who want to succeed, who want to be great, are coachable because, look, we've all seen some great leaders out there, great world leaders who have had coaching. So, for example, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton. But I'm sure you can think of a lot of successful leaders out there who probably ought to have had some coaching. And I think the difference is making successful people into great leaders. And that's what you can develop through coaching and through a changing culture, actually.
And that has enormous impact on the businesses themselves. So going back to that whole thing there about why people don't do it, in sports teams they've got assets who they're paying enormous amounts to. So they put huge emphasis on the physical training of that athlete, but they put equal focus on the emotional training of that athlete as well to make them play at their best all the way through. In business, it's not necessarily the same sort of thing, and I think companies there who are looking at this saying, right, how can we get the most out of our people, are starting to invest in executive coaching and starting to think about how do we get the best out of our individuals on a sustained basis. Now, when I look at that and I think of the benefits to a company of how that can work out and what's in it for them, which has obviously got to be, because it's an investment, right? It's an investment of finance on one side, but it's also an investment of time. And time spent out of that person's job doing something there which isn't necessarily paying the bills straight away. So I look at a sales management course that I put my team on recently, or about the start of last year, and it required a full day a month for 6 months from it, and it was always the counterbalance between the stress of actually investing that sort of time away from their teams and their desks to actually the development it would have at the same sort of stage. And I think there's a pressure on, particularly now and particularly in the times that we're in at the moment, there's a pressure on instantaneous return and there's a pressure on success. But I think there's also a hell of a lot bigger a win for a company to invest in that sort of thing and see what the results are from it. So talk to me a little bit about the benefits of executive coaching. We've spoken a little bit about it from an individual perspective, but you mentioned a really important word just before, which is culture, but also to the business itself. What have you seen transformation-wise from companies that have invested in that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, a series of questions, because actually for me it's all about a coaching culture, and if you can get the culture right, you get the high-performing teams, and then you get your investment. And actually I think a lot of businesses are asking, what is the return on investment? Because they can see the individual benefit. They can say, okay, well, you've got this successful person, your coaching's made them into a great leader, so what difference does that make to us? And actually, particularly in America, they've been doing a lot of research on the return on investment from coaching, because obviously it is a big industry now. And a recent US Metrics Global study found that the return on investment for coaching was 788%.
Is that right?
But that was also based on increased productivity, as well as factors such as employee retainment, which you discussed earlier, which is a big thing. So that's huge. That's $7.88 for every $1 spent on coaching. The International Coaching Federation in 2022, they reported that coaching results in a 70% improvement in individual performance, a 50% improvement on team performance, and a 48% improvement on organisational performance. So that's quite impressive.
Yeah.
And actually, the Hay Group, that's the HR consultancy, the US, they found that 40% of Fortune 500 companies invested in coaching last year.
Is that right?
Which is enormous, actually, and they say it's on the increase. But what I thought was really interesting is that Goldman Sachs boasts on their website that they offer one-to-one coaching as part of their leadership development program.
Okay.
And I think you probably
and that's with specific coaches themselves, or
so that's one-to-one coaching.
Yeah.
So they may have
from people
panel.
inside the organisation, outside, or both.
I think they probably use both, actually.
Yeah.
And some people will say, I want this person to coach me because I've got that sort of chemistry, or I've heard of this person.
Yeah.
Because you've got to get the chemistry right. So I always offer a sort of initial chemistry session before I start coaching with people.
Okay.
Because you've got to be able to trust and confide in your coach and be absolutely honest with them.
And that works two ways, I guess, with you as well, about whether you can actually say yes to that person.
Definitely.
I mean, that's a tough conversation to have there.
Yeah, definitely. But there are always those uncoachable people.
Yeah.
So it's got, the person being coached has to want to be there too.
I guess that comes down to growth and fixed mindsets and all the Carol Dweck stuff around there as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The culture piece, I think, is something which I've always been fascinated in, and I think it's something there which people sort of generally tend to sort of write about, and they say this is what we're doing, and this is our culture, and this is who we are, but never actually think about how they can actually bring it through. You mentioned something quite interesting there about a coaching culture, a learning culture, which then creates a high performance culture behind it. So I think a lot of companies will talk about high performing cultures or elite performance cultures, etc. But there's foundations underneath that, and I think those high-performing companies are generally ones who are constantly thirsting to learn, constantly thirsting to be better, and then creating those coaching environments. So how do companies that you've worked with foster great coaching environments?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's the culture, isn't it, that fosters that high team performance. You've got to get that culture right, and I think the problem we've got is that that whole old-fashioned kind of carrot and stick approach just doesn't work, and it's actually unacceptable these days. And so what we've got to do is try and embed that sort of coaching culture into the sort of fabric, into the identity of an organisation. But it really sort of starts with sort of individual teams and leaders, because if you just focus on results and performance, you're not going to get the right culture, because if you do that, you focus on results and performance, you ignore the process and you ignore the learning and the enjoyment. And this is actually back to Timothy Galway's work triangle. So he's got performance there on one side, and he's got enjoyment and learning on the other sides. And actually, to get the right culture, it's a balance of those, because it's not static. They're all sort of interchangeable, and getting that balance right is really important, because what can happen is businesses push for performance and they forget the learning and the enjoyment, and then the performance suffers in the long run.
Yeah.
And then what happens is that managers push for performance, even more and more, results performance, and then if you completely forget and diminish that sort of enjoyment and learning in particular, you get that sort of downward spiral, and then performance actually loses any potential whatsoever.
Yeah, it's the performance spiral, I think, is a fascinating thing, isn't it? Because it's like a loss of focus trying to chase a result. And then the lack of focus leads to a lack of confidence, which then leads to a lack of motivation. And all of a sudden, it's a very different and difficult ship to move around. And I think that's probably a big part of one of the major challenges that the world's facing at the moment. And this is the productivity crisis. So you mentioned productivity beforehand. And I think companies are constantly looking for more and bigger and better and quicker and faster and everything that's associated in that. And there's more heads that go into it. So today I wrote on LinkedIn about the big tech layoffs. And actually, when I look at the big tech numbers, it's extraordinary levels of growth. Like hundreds of thousands of people hired over the course of a year, which is overgrowth over a particular area. And when you look at it, and even if you look, however controversial it is, you look at Elon Musk's view when he took over Twitter, it was a stodgy business that had didn't have high talent density and had too many people doing too little in it. And we're sat there with a productivity crisis globally of countries having more and more people in work but getting less and less done. And I think that productivity per head piece is such a critical factor that people don't necessarily think about. And when you're talking about the benefits of coaching and saying how can we get people playing at their absolute best, how can we get people pushing the level of their capability and capacity, that's where engagement comes from. And you push a little bit too hard on that, and all of a sudden it comes out into that sort of where people are constantly outside their comfort zone and unskilled to be able to perform at that sort of level, and that's where productivity crashes there afterwards. So it's a really fine line, right? It's
a really fine line, and I think the way to do that is to embed the coaching into sort of leaders, individual teams, then across the culture, because as you say, that productivity piece is really difficult, but actually it can be achieved. So, for example, my sort of example of a coaching style leadership, I had a girl who was put into my team once who was very junior, and I was told by head of department, you've got to sort this person out because her billing targets are way off, and if it doesn't improve, she's down on the formal warning, etc. And so this girl came to me, very junior lawyer, bit of a rabbit in the headlights, had a bad experience in another firm with her training contract, and she just had no confidence at all. And actually it was through coaching, or being coached myself, that I sort of learned how to sort of adopt this coaching style leadership. And the carrot and stick approach doesn't work. Telling her to bill more, work more hours, perform harder doesn't work. And so what I did is I took this girl aside and I taught her what I knew. I mentored her, and through my own coaching I realised that you can't ruminate on past mistakes because that doesn't work. Yes, of course you've got to learn, take the learning out of it, but what is key is to focus on how we might make things better. How are we going to make things better for our clients? It's amazing because once you get that engagement and through the learning, people think, well, actually, this isn't just a job now. Somebody's invested in my career, and there's a difference between a job and a career. And I think if people know that, you get the performance, because actually that person suddenly became more engaged, her performance soared, and it wasn't rocket science.
And it's the same person doing the same job, just with a different set of eyes on the whole concept.
Absolutely. And now that person's very successful and very senior. And I've seen that person mentoring more junior people, and there've been quite a few people that have gone through that cycle, and I think that's what you need, is for people to feel absolutely engaged.
This is a really interesting thing for me, because I think about my career over the last 25 odd years, and there are people there who've been outstanding in one company who are just awful in another bit. And generally, I think there's a really interesting bit about people coming into a business right at the very start. And I think that when they come in and they might have a point to prove, they end up losing track of the process piece that's made them successful, and they're just constantly trying to prove that they're good at their job. And then that can very quickly become a spiral for them to move away, and they never quite attain the potential of what they can do or what they've done before. And it's a very difficult thing to explain to people, just to chill out a little bit and be cool and relax and allow those the sort of score to take care of itself. As a book by Bill Walsh wrote, one of my favourite books of all time, is just actually just favouring process over results, which sounds counterintuitive when there's a lot of pressure for results in the world. But I think that process bit is so important, and I love the fact of that of how seeing someone seeing the world through a slightly different set of eyes can transform performance alongside it. There's a LinkedIn cartoon that I constantly see, and it's two people on a bus, and one person's looking out of one window, and one person, you might have seen it, one person's looking out the other. And this one person's got this sort of cloud over his head, a sort of sad face, and he's looking at this rock face. So I imagine it going down around the Alps or something like that, and he's looking at a rock face. And the other person's got this sunshine and a big smiley face, looking at this amazing view over the other side of it. And I often think metaphorically about people looking through two different windows, doing exactly the same job, and just seeing it in completely different ways and getting completely different results because of the mentality of where they see it. And I think that, to me, is the crux of coaching and self-development. And I think it's the whole thing there, isn't it, about people who are investing time into wanting to be the very best they can be. And that's a question which I want to get into, and we kind of discussed it a little bit about the willingness and is everyone coachable. But do you think that you can get through to people who are, I guess, sceptical about the concept of wanting to do that, or do they have to have an innate desire to want to be the best they can be at what they're doing to attain that high performance? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You can definitely get through to people. Some people are slightly resistant when they come to coaching.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to say they're uncoachable. Some people are terrified by it because actually it's a bit like the top athletes. It involves a lot of commitment and a lot of hard work. It's not easy, but actually it is about having that time and space, which is an investment, because you've got to get off that rat run, you've got to get off the hamster wheel, because otherwise you're not going to actually perform at your best. And you've got to have that space and that clarity of thought to think, how can I actually work to my best? How can I unlock that potential? What do I need to do more of?
Yeah.
How can I make myself better, and how can I make things better for my clients and my stakeholders? Can be transformative, and I'm really sort of into the whole psychological dimensions of coaching, and it's self-awareness that's really key to making change happen.
Yeah, I think there's a really important part of that sort of self-awareness piece, isn't it, that people just misinterpret. I think there's the great Sun Tzu quote about, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. And I think that know yourself bit comes first, right from the offset of it. Joe, I know that you've spoken about your background before being in the legal sector. This is, as we've spoken before, the lessons from sport come across to business. The lessons from businesses can be transferable to each part of it as well. If we look at where you're aiming and who you're speaking to at the moment, the people you're helping. I've known your husband for a long time. He's been in the financial technology space. The people who are watching this are generally in the financial technology sector. Tell me about how transferable your background is and the things you've learned to be able to come into a different sector and again dramatically improve the productivity of the people who you're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. So in coaching, it's all about being a thought partner, and I think my background helps me sort of be grounded in the sort of leadership experience that I've had, and also the experience of the corporate world and business. And actually, yes, I coach lawyers, but I don't just coach lawyers, because I'm not there as a business consultant. I can't tell you what to do with your business. In fact, I'm not insured for that, but I am insured for coaching. And I think it helps actually sometimes not to be in the sector, because it means that you're not judgmental. You know, you're there very much as an independent person, as a thought partner. And actually, I've recently coached a CFO of a FinTech company, a board director of a data analytics company. Gosh, I've coached a head teacher. I've even coached a budding rock star. So you can coach people in every industry. But I think with my background in particular, such a long background in law and leadership, I really do like coaching people in leadership roles in any business environment. I think
that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I do think it's transferable, but I also think the legal profession is a really interesting one, because I think I've spoken to you about this before. My dad was a lawyer for 45 odd years, and stayed very much down that traditional practice sort of route. But the more I'm looking at it now and understanding more is there's a lot of people who are moving out of the sector and using the skills which have been gained to being really strong entrepreneurs afterwards. So I've spoken to a number of different people on this podcast, of clients over the years, who are FinTech entrepreneurs who've come from a legal background, because I think a lot of the practical common sense aspects of it all allow people to be successful there afterwards. So yeah, look, I think it's a subject which is very close to my heart. I could be speaking about it for ages. I want to finish, we've spoken a little bit about you being able to help people across all sorts of sectors in that leadership piece. I think it's incredibly important. I think we've established already during this conversation how transformative it can be for companies and their success alongside it as well. So the only thing that remains for me to say today is with people who are watching this and saying, I need to invest in this, I need to get in touch with you, what is the best way to get in touch with you and how should they do that?
Great. Well, you can contact me via LinkedIn. Just put in Joe Bower, Bower on LinkedIn, or my website is called Beckhuson. That's BECKHUSON.com.
There we go. Well, you've heard it here first. That's the way to get in touch with Joe. I've loved it. Thank you very much for coming in and joining us today on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching. We will see you soon on another episode of FinTech Focus TV. Thanks a lot.